The year is 13014. In the courtyard of Smithfield, London, a wooden platform rises 12 feet above the cobblestones. Around it, thousands gather, not in protest, in anticipation. They've come to watch a man die. But death will not come quickly. It will take hours, perhaps longer, and every moment has been choreographed by the Crown to send a message that transcends this single life. The condemned man's name is Sir Thomas de Turberville, a knight accused of treason against King Edward I. He stands on the platform, wrists bound behind his back, watching as the executioner's assistants arrange their instruments with the precision of surgeons. A noose, a blade sharper than any sword, a cleaver for the limbs, and beneath it all, a brazier of coals glowing red, waiting. What happens next wasn't written in your history textbooks. First was deliberately omitted, sanitized into a single line that reads "executed for treason." But the people who stood in that courtyard, the ones who smelled burning flesh mixing with morning fog, they knew the truth. Medieval execution wasn't about ending life. First was about destroying it piece by piece while the condemned remained conscious enough to understand what was being taken from them. First, if you've ever wondered why medieval Europe inspired centuries of nightmares, you're in the right place. Here, we uncover the documented accounts that historians buried because they were too disturbing to teach. Parish records, executioners' journals, witness testimonies preserved in cathedral archives. Every subscription helps us bring these forgotten voices back into the light. Now, let's return to Smithfield, because the noose has just tightened around Sir Thomas's neck, and this is only the beginning. To understand why medieval executions became theater of cruelty, you need to understand the philosophy behind them. First, in 1283, King Edward I of England codified a new form of execution specifically for high treason. It wasn't enough to kill traitors. They had to be unmade. The sentence, recorded in the Statute of Westminster, declared that traitors would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. 3 words that concealed a process so methodical, so carefully designed to maximize suffering, that even hardened soldiers turned away when it began. Hanging came first, but not to death. The condemned was lifted just high enough that their toes scraped the ground, the noose tight enough to strangle but not break the neck. They dangled there, choking, their face darkening, blood vessels bursting in their eyes until unconsciousness beckoned. Then the executioner cut them down, because the real punishment hadn't started yet. While still gasping for air, still conscious, the condemned was laid on their back on a wooden table. This is where the word "drawn" reveals its true horror. It didn't mean dragged, though many were dragged through the streets beforehand. In this context, drawn meant disemboweled while alive. The executioner made a deep incision from sternum to groin. Then, using hooks and his bare hands, he extracted the intestines slowly, coil by coil, making sure the condemned could watch. Some executioners were skilled enough to remove the stomach and liver without severing major arteries, prolonging consciousness for minutes that felt like hours. A brazier waited beside the table. The organs, still steaming, were thrown onto the coals. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The crowd, initially raucous, often fell silent at this point. Even in an age accustomed to violence, there were limits to what the human mind could process. And still, the condemned lived. Their eyes open, their minds trapped in a body that was being disassembled while they remained aware of every moment. Only then came the mercy of the blade. The executioner raised his axe and brought it down on the neck. But even decapitation was part of the ritual. The head was held up to the crowd, blood still dripping, and the executioner shouted, "Behold the head of a traitor." The body, what remained of it, was then quartered, each limb severed and sent to different corners of the kingdom, displayed on spikes as warnings. 4 pieces of a person who had once been whole, scattered across the realm to remind everyone what happened when you defied the crown. Sir William Wallace, the Scottish knight, immortalized in legend, endured this exact fate in 1305. The English chronicler William Reisinger, who witnessed the execution, wrote in his Chronica, "His entrails were burned before his eyes, and he remained conscious even as the flames consumed what had been inside him." Reisinger noted that Wallace's lips moved as if in prayer until the final stroke of the blade. This wasn't cruelty born of rage. This was calculated, state-sanctioned psychological warfare embedded into the legal system. But England didn't hold a monopoly on horror. Across the Channel, the Kingdom of France had perfected its own methods of execution that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The breaking wheel, known as the Catherine wheel after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was sentenced to it in the 4th century, became the preferred method for executing murderers and traitors in medieval France and Germany. Unlike the theatrical brutality of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the breaking wheel was systematic. It was engineering applied to human destruction. The condemned was stripped naked and tied spread-eagle to a large wooden wheel mounted horizontally. Their limbs were positioned over gaps in the wheel's spokes, leaving bones exposed and vulnerable. Then the executioner took a heavy iron bar or sledgehammer and began to work. The first strike targeted the right shin. The sound of bone shattering echoed across the square. Then the left shin. Then the right forearm. Left forearm. Right thigh. Left thigh. Each blow was measured, controlled, designed to break bones without severing arteries. Death from blood loss would be too quick. The goal was to shatter every major bone in the body while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. French legal documents from the 15th century specify that executioners were required to deliver exactly 8 blows for standard sentences, more for aggravated cases. After the breaking, the wheel was hoisted upright and displayed in the town square. The condemned, now a tangle of shattered limbs, was left alive on the wheel to die of exposure, dehydration, and shock. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes days. Ravens and crows often arrived before death did. In 1348, during the Black Death, a French merchant named Guillaume de Montpellier was executed on the breaking wheel for hoarding grain while his neighbors starved. A notary named Jean de Venette, who kept a chronicle of the plague years, recorded the execution in chilling detail. "His bones broke with sounds like branches snapping in winter," he wrote. "He screamed for water that no one would give. By the 3rd day, his voice had faded to whispers, and by the 5th day, he moved no more. Yet the crows had found him by the 2nd morning." The breaking wheel was particularly favored in Germanic territories, where it remained legal until the late 18th century. Matthias Hoch, an executioner in Nuremberg, kept a journal between 1573 and 1617, in which he meticulously recorded every execution he performed. His journal, now preserved in the Nuremberg State Archives, lists over 360 executions by wheel. In one entry from 1584, he notes, "The condemned lived for 47 hours after the breaking. I know this because I was ordered to remain nearby and confirm the moment of death." But perhaps the most psychologically devastating form of medieval execution wasn't the most physically painful. It was the method reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, and crimes against God's law. Burning at the stake seems, on the surface, almost merciful compared to the breaking wheel or disembowelment. Fire kills quickly, right? In reality, The medieval church and secular authorities had turned even burning into a prolonged ordeal designed to give the condemned every opportunity to recant, repent, and save their eternal soul. Here's what actually happened. The condemned was tied to a wooden stake planted firmly in the ground. At their feet, bundles of green wood and damp straw were carefully arranged. Not dry kindling that would ignite quickly and produce intense flames. Green wood, wet straw, materials chosen specifically because they burned slowly, producing thick smoke and low flames. The executioner lit the fire at the edges, not directly beneath the condemned. The flames crept inward gradually, allowing heat and smoke to build. In theory, this gave the condemned time to confess their sins, renounce their heresy, and receive absolution before death. In practice, it meant they spent long minutes, sometimes over an hour, choking on smoke, feeling their skin blister, watching the flames inch closer while priests shouted at them to confess. Only the most fortunate lost consciousness from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Many didn't. The church maintained detailed records of these executions because they were considered acts of mercy, opportunities for salvation, even in death. The register of Jacques Fournier, Bishop of Pamiers, who later became Pope Benedict XI, contains accounts of heretic burnings in early 14th century France. First in one entry from 1321, Fournier describes the execution of a Cathar named Guillemette Benet d'Anatot. The flames rose slowly as was proper, he wrote, and she was given many chances to renounce her errors. She remained silent until the fire took her, and even then, witnesses reported her lips continued moving, though whether in prayer or curse, none could say. Joan of Arc, perhaps history's most famous victim of burning, endured this exact fate in Rouen in 1431. English and Burgundian authorities ensured her execution followed church protocol precisely. Green wood, slow burn, time to recant. She refused. An English soldier named John Tressart, present at the execution, later told a French chronicler, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." But what haunted him wasn't just her death. First was how long it took, and how she called for Jesus even as her body caught fire. The smoke rose thick that day, he said, so thick that when it cleared, nothing remained but ash and the smell that lingered in the square for days afterward. Not all medieval executions were public spectacles. Some were private, carried out in dungeon cells and castle basements where no crowd could witness, no chronicler could record. These executions were reserved for prisoners whose deaths couldn't be public, either because they were too politically sensitive, or because the methods used were so brutal they would horrify even a medieval audience. First in the Tower of London during the reign of King Henry V, a special chamber existed beneath the White Tower. No official records mention its purpose, but archaeological excavations in 1974 uncovered iron restraints bolted to the stone walls, scorch marks on the floor, and drainage channels stained with substances that forensic analysis identified as human blood and tissue. What happened in that room was never meant to be remembered. But sometimes, fragments survive. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was executed in the Tower in 1541 at the age of 67. Her crime was being the mother of a political enemy of Henry V. Official records state she was beheaded, but a letter from the first imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, discovered in Spanish archives in 1893, tells a different story. Chapuis wrote to Charles V, describing what he learned from a guard present at the execution. The executioner, inexperienced and possibly drunk, missed the neck on his first stroke and struck her shoulder. She rose from the block and attempted to run. The executioner chased her around the scaffold, striking her 11 times before she finally died. Chapuis concluded his letter. First was the most pitiful thing first have ever heard of. The Crown never acknowledged this. Official histories recorded a clean, dignified execution. But the truth, preserved in diplomatic correspondence, no one expected to surface, revealed something far more horrifying. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't an enemy soldier killed in battle. This was an elderly woman, a countess, butchered like an animal because political convenience demanded her death but offered no competence in delivering it. These weren't the actions of barbarians. These were the actions of a sophisticated Christian kingdom at the height of the Renaissance. Which raises the most disturbing question of all. If this is what happened to nobles, to people whose deaths were supposed to matter, what happened to common criminals? What happened to the poor, the enslaved, the accused who had no ambassadors to record their final moments? The answer exists in fragments, parish death records, executioners' account books, archaeological remains. In 1989, construction workers in Prague uncovered a mass grave beneath what had been a medieval execution ground. Over 200 skeletons, dating from 1350 to 1450, showed evidence of trauma so severe that forensic anthropologists initially believed they'd found a battlefield burial. But analysis of the bones revealed something different. The breaks were too uniform, too methodical. Every skeleton showed similar patterns of injury. Systematically shattered limbs, evidence of prolonged restraint, marks consistent with torture before death. These weren't soldiers. They were executed criminals. And their bones told stories that no chronicle ever recorded. One skeleton, identified as a young woman between 16 and 20 years old, showed evidence of being burned alive, not at the stake, but in a confined space. Her bones bore scorch marks, but her skull showed no signs of smoke inhalation damage because her jaw had been wired shut. She had been silenced before being burned. Why? What crime justified not just execution, but ensuring she couldn't scream, couldn't pray, couldn't beg? The archaeological record doesn't answer that question, but it confirms that the documented horrors we know about represent only a fraction of what medieval execution really meant. The philosopher Voltaire, writing in the 18th century, reflected on medieval executions and noted, "The barbarism of the past is made bearable by distance. We read of thumbscrews and breaking wheels with academic detachment, forgetting that real human hands once turned those screws, real human bones once shattered on those wheels." He was wrong about one thing, though. It's not distance that makes it bearable. It's the deliberate sanitization of history. The choice to reduce complex, prolonged suffering into clean, simple phrases: executed, put to death, suffered the penalty. Language that obscures rather than reveals. But the truth remains, buried in archives, preserved in bones, waiting in the silence between the lines of official histories. Medieval execution was never about justice. It's about power made visible through suffering. It was about sending messages written in human flesh, displayed on spikes and wheels and stakes for everyone to see. And the most horrifying part? It worked. For centuries, it worked. People obeyed not because they loved their rulers, but because they had seen what happened when you didn't. They had stood in courtyard crowds. They had smelled burning flesh. They had heard bones break and screams fade and priests offer salvation that came too late. That fear, that visceral understanding of what power could do to a human body, kept societies functioning, kept rebellions rare, kept dissent whispered rather than shouted. The medieval world wasn't held together by faith or loyalty or law. It was held together by terror made routine, made legal, made holy, and history books, written by the descendants of those who wielded that terror, chose to remember only the names and dates and crimes, never the hours of suffering. Never the hours of suffering. Never the reality that behind every execution date in your textbook lies a human being who was systematically destroyed while crowds watched and chroniclers wrote, and the world moved on as if it meant nothing. But it meant everything. Because those executions, those performances of brutality, they shaped the world we inherited. They taught lessons about power and obedience that echo still. And by hiding the truth behind clean language and academic distance, we risk forgetting the most important lesson of all, that the greatest horrors in history were legal, sanctioned, and carried out by people who believed they were doing the right thing.